All right. Good afternoon. It is not quite 12, but it's going to be afternoon before I'm done. Thanks for having us here today. We so enjoy our brothers and sisters from New Braunfels. It was a sweet Sabbath we were able to spend together at Greater Randolph before you found this place. And this is a lovely place to be meeting on a Sabbath morning. So, we're glad to be here. Brenda is with me. She taught Sabbath school at Randolph this morning, so that's why we got here a little bit later than we would have otherwise. But we are, glad to spend the Sabbath with you. Let me talk a little bit about Russia, refugees, and you. We have a Russian aggression, invasion of a sovereign country, resulting in a humanitarian crisis and a river of refugees. But I'm not talking about Ukraine. And I'm not talking about the year 2022. But it sure does rhyme. His name is Chiune. Chiune Sugihara. He's often called Sempo, and when I first came across his story, I wasn't sure I believed it. Because it sounded like, some kind of fish tale. Kind of like, Davy Crockett here in Texas, right? A story based in some truth, but exaggerated beyond all proportions because some people needed a hero. We do that, don't we? That's what I thought was happening with Chiune, but I researched it further. I was able to corroborate his story with multiple sources. Right? The Holocaust Memorial website. And when I read the study done on him by Stanford University, found some articles in U.S. News and World Report, PBS actually made a documentary about his life. And it was true. It was 1940 in the small country of Lithuania. One of those Baltic states that we hear so much about in the news today because they are next targets for Putin's aggression should he be successful in the Ukraine. But back in 1940, Western Europe was embroiled in World War II. Sugihara was a career Japanese diplomat recently assigned to Kaunas, the capital of Lithuania. Or at least it was at that time. Vilnius is now the capital, but back in 1940, Kaunas was. And that's where he had been sent. He was sent there to staff a one-man consulate, Japanese consulate there. And while Sugihara wasn't really a spy per se, his title was cover for his real duties. His real duties were to report to Japan on Russian and German troop movements. That was his job. You have to understand that sometime prior to this assignment, Sugihara had converted from traditional ancestor worship to Christianity while serving, in all places, Manchuria. It's curious to me that we have here a Japanese man being brought to belief in Jesus while in China. But now here we are, many years and many thousands of miles away. Sugihara's belief was to be put to the test. Sugihara had been in Lithuania only a few short months when in June of 1940, Germany invaded Poland. That resulted in a wave of Jewish refugees pouring into Lithuania to escape deportation and death at the hand of the Nazis. To add to that desperate situation, Russian troops rolled in from the east and annexed Lithuania in July. Not much different than the annexation of Crimea in 2014. They rolled in, toppled the government, and they ordered all foreign embassies closed. In Lithuania, nearly all the embassies complied with Russia's order to leave the country, the consulates closing their doors, their envoys returning safely home, obeying orders and getting out of harm's way. Only 2 consuls applied for permission to stay on a little bit longer. The Netherlands and Japan. Sugihara was granted only 3 weeks to close up shop. 3 weeks. And hundreds of Jewish peoples whose lives hung in the balance. You see, the Nazis were behind them, blocking their passage west. The Soviet occupation of Lithuania provided no security, and the Jewish people had nowhere to run but east through Russia. All 11 time zones of Russia. And no one to turn to except those 2 remaining consulates. Russia, no friend to the Jews, would not accept the refugees. But they would allow them passage by train through Siberia on 2 conditions. 1, they must pay 5 times the usual price for the train fare. Yeah. 2, they must have a visa from the country to which they were traveling. But no country would give them a visa. In fact, I've read the official communications between Sugihara and his superiors in Tokyo. Sugihara keeps explaining that there are no consulates left open to issue visas to a destination country. Enter the Dutch. For a fee, the Dutch consul could grant the refugees entry into, get this, Suriname and Curacao. Two Dutch colonies in South America. These Jewish refugees had never heard of these far-off places. But here was their opportunity. If Japan would grant them 10-day transit visas, not entry visas, not permanent visas, just 10-day passing through transit visas. The Jewish refugees could, theoretically, take the train from Kaunas through Siberia to Vladivostok, pass through Japan, and set sail for freedom in South America. Waking to find hundreds of Jewish refugees camped outside his door, Sugihara cabled his superiors for permission to issue the transit visas. Again, not permanent visas, just transit visas. Permission denied. Three times, Sugihara asked Tokyo to allow him to grant the visas. The third time, the cable came back. Concerning transit visas requested previously, stop. Advise absolutely not to be issued to any traveler not holding firm end visa with guaranteed departure from Japan. Stop. No exceptions. Stop. No further inquiries expected. End of transmission. Stop. Permission denied. At this point, Sugihara has a decision to make. He has a choice. And the choice very well could have been, this is too big a problem, and it's not my problem. I have a direct order to not do this. If I defy orders and do it, I'll lose my career in disgrace. I'll be unable to support my wife and young children. He has 4 young kids at this time. It's not my problem. Therefore, I'm just going to close the doors. I will have served my country honorably. I will have personal security in troubled times. He could have said, they're my enemy. Remember, Germany and Japan, the original axis of evil. But as a believer, Sugihara knew that God the Father is not the enemy of my enemies. God isn't even the enemy of his enemies. So instead, after discussing the matter with his wife, Sugihara chose to protect lives instead of his livelihood. He defied the orders, defied his superiors, and began issuing transit visas. Please understand, I had trouble believing this story. You see, I worked for a Japanese company for 25 years. And in over 2 decades of working directly with the Japanese, side by side, every day, I have never once seen one of them defy an order from a superior. It's just not done. I've seen my American coworkers blow off the boss's directive, right? Sure, boss, I'll get on that right away. No, right? But I've never seen a Japanese disobey orders from the Home Office. It's just anathema to them. A Japanese employee may, in fact, vehemently disagree with a superior's decision, but he will comply. But Sugihara didn't comply. Instead, for 29 days, he hand wrote visas in triplicate as fast as he could, 18 to 20 hours a day, not stopping to eat a proper meal. He wrote more visas in a day than would normally be written in a month. His wife, Yukiko, would massage his hand and ice his shoulder just to keep him going. And when the Russian authorities came and they closed the consulate, Sugihara kept right on writing visas to the very last moment. While on the train, waiting to pull out of the station, he was still stamping visas, throwing them out the window, and some say that as the train pulled away, he reached out the window and handed his stamp to a refugee on the platform and said, "Keep stamping." Permission granted. Keep stamping. To date, over 2,000 visas, 2,000 visas have been found bearing his stamp. And most of these were to heads of household, heads of families, allowing the entire family passage and escape. Estimates, 6,000 to 10,000 refugees owed their lives to Sugihara. Now, we're 2 generations later. 40,000 to 50,000 people can trace their very lives to Sugihara's choice. Sugihara did lose his job. His livelihood, his position in society. Upon return to Japan, never worked for the government again. Took odd jobs to support his family during and after the war. Eventually became a middle manager for a trading company because he spoke Russian. Sugihara was a humble man. He never spoke about what he'd done or the lives he'd saved. In fact, it wasn't until 1969, nearly 30 years later, that one of the survivors found him. Soon, many more were telling the story of Chiune Sugihara's compassion. And ultimately, the stories were investigated by a commission of the Israeli Supreme Court. It was all true. And the state of Israel did what they could. In 1985, they named Chiune Sugihara, listen to this, not a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. They named him Righteous Among the Nations. The highest honor that could be bestowed to a non-Jew. By that time, at 85 years old, Sugihara was too frail and too sick to travel. He never did see Israel. never sat in the park in Jerusalem named in his honor. Sugihara died July 31st, 1986. 46 years to the day that he made his choice and picked up that pen. It is customary for the Japanese, when they come to this country, to take on an American name. It's easier to pronounce, and I think they believe it helps them fit in. That's why I had Japanese coworkers named Ken and Sean, a good Irish Catholic Japanese name, Sean. And Mac, had one named Mac. In fact, my Japanese coworker Ken named his American-born daughter Cookie. But back in 1985, when Chiune Sugihara was named Righteous Among the Nations, that came with a couple of perks. He was offered the privilege which comes with that honor: Israeli citizenship and a pension. He chose not to accept these. But I like to think that if he had accepted citizenship in Israel, perhaps he would have taken on a new name. Maybe he would have picked a Hebrew name, easier for them to pronounce. And in my opinion, that name should have been Oded. Turn with me to 2 Chronicles. Second Chronicles, chapter 28. Second Chronicles 28 tells us of an episode during the time of the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah. 2 Chronicles chapter 28. Ahaz sits on the throne in Jerusalem, a wicked king in Judah. Worshipped Baal, made idols, child sacrifice, and generally acted like the Canaanites they were supposed to have rejected. The northern kingdom of Israel under Pekah fought and defeated Ahaz. But was the victory won on their merits? Was Pekah stronger, better equipped, better trained? Did Israel have better strategies or smarter commanders? Look at verse 6. Second Chronicles 28, verse 6. In one day, Pekah, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah. Why? Because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. God had removed his protection from Judah. And as the commentary points out, when the protection of the Lord is withdrawn, man discovers to his sorrow that the master he has chosen can be exceedingly cruel. Down to verse 8. The Israelites took captive from their kinsmen 200,000 wives, sons, and daughters. They also took a great deal of plunder, which they carried back to Samaria. They were from where? What an army. Pekah's soldiers had defeated 120,000 of what the King James called Judah's valiant men. And now they were leading a procession of captives. How many? 200,000. 200,000 of the saddest, most hopeless, most bedraggled boys, girls, and women that you could imagine. It was a trail of tears. The men, they're all dead. Who are these people? They're the wives and children who were left after the battle. Widows and, my sister, orphans. They are hopeless because there are no husbands, brothers, uncles, or fathers left to come and rescue them. Widows and orphans, the very people God had instructed his children to protect. What do you think, 250,000 people? Between the captives and the returning soldiers? Exulting in their triumph. Fevered with victory. Celebrating their spoils, thinking about dividing the plunder. More hands to add to the workforce. Look at those young guys. And hey, more slave girls. Can't you just picture their swagger as they approach the gates of their capital city of Samaria? It's likely that most of the inhabitants of the city turned out to greet their returning heroes and husbands. Everyone's excited about the victory. Let's look at this parade coming into the city. The whole town is abuzz. The dignitaries in the front, ready to welcome and praise the troops. It's going to be a regular ticker-tape parade. But, verse 9. Verse 9. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there. But wait, something's going to happen here. Oded looked at this procession. He didn't see the riches. He didn't see spoils of war. He saw his brethren. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there, and he went out to meet the army when it returned to Samaria. He said to them, because the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. He knew what the soldiers were planning, and he knew it was wrong. God had clearly instructed in Leviticus that his people were not to be enslaved. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with rigor. You aren't to forcibly enslave your brother. And the verse continues, if thy brother was poor and sell himself unto the stranger, if he sells himself into slavery, after that he is sold, he may be, redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. We are not called to enslave. We are called to redeem. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there, and he went out to meet the army when it returned to Samaria. He said to them, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. And now You intend to make the men and women of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves? But aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? Can't you understand that there but by the grace of God go us? Now listen to me, the verse continues. And send back your fellow countrymen that you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. That's it. That's all we know about Oded is those 3 verses. And in one other instance that mentions his son. That's it. 3 verses, and he's gone. But in those 3 verses, Oded takes a stand. It's like that lone man in Tiananmen Square who stood before the powerful military of his own country and said, "This cannot proceed." Oded may well be the Bible's first activist. He personally stood to gain nothing, yet he was risking everything. In modern terms, we might say that Oded was to Jerusalem captives what the white civil rights workers were in our country. They're not part of the oppressed, stood to gain nothing, yet risked everything, much like Chiune Sugihara. Oded looked at that long line of captives and the triumphant soldiers. He saw that cheering crowd. Oded knew that a great sin was about to be committed, an evil which could not be undone. Because once the captive children were separated from their mothers, once the prisoners had been sent to sundry parts of the kingdom, once the women had been taken, there would be no way to make this right. Oded had just moments in which to make his choice. Like Sugihara, Oded could have said, "It's too big. It's not my problem. I'll risk my reputation, my influence, my standing in society. With all these soldiers here, I may even be risking my life." Oded looks around. He's in the middle of a crowd. He's looking at the leaders, the diplomats, right there in front. Isn't someone going to stop this? Don't they know how wrong this is? But in the faces around him, Oded sees no reflection of his internal conflict. So Oded makes his choice. He steps out of the comfort and complacency of the crowd, swallows hard, and prophesies, speaks forth the word of the Lord. "Now listen to me. Send back your fellow countrymen, your brethren, you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you." What? What did he say? That little man's crazy. I'm fixing to... Right? You know what? Before the crowd could recover from its shock at Oded's audacity, before the soldiers could reach for their swords, 4 other voices chime in. Verse 12. Then some of the leaders in Ephraim, Azariah, the son of Jehonahan, Berechiah, son of Meshillemoth, Jehizkiah, son of Shallum, and Amasa, son of Hadlai, confronted those who were arriving from the war. "You must not bring those prisoners here," they said, "or we will be guilty before the Lord. Do you intend to add to our sin and guilt? For our guilt is already great, and his fierce anger rests on Israel." Those soldiers have been proud. Hadn't they just won a great victory? Didn't that mean God was with them? What do you mean his fierce anger rests on Israel? If you're having success in your life, doesn't that mean you're living under God's blessing? How are we going to reconcile this, family? Just as suffering in this life does not necessarily mean that God is punishing you, success in this life does not necessarily indicate God's favor. Yes, the soldiers were successful, and no, God was not pleased with them. Yes, Israel was victorious over Judah, and no, God was not pleased with them. But God always has a remnant. Those who still value his laws and listen to his voice. And often there are more of them than is immediately apparent. Oded, like Elijah before him, may have felt he was the only faithful one left. But God said, "Oh no, I've got more in Israel who are faithful to me." In this case, 4 of them. You know, at first I was pretty hard on these 4 princes. Oh yeah, sure. Wait till Oded sticks his neck out and says something, and then you get your courage. What, I bet if Oded doesn't say a thing, you don't speak up either. But it was pointed out to me, I think by my wife, that's not fair. Because praise his name, God in his grace gives us all many chances to do what's right. Yes, it's true that Oded spoke first, and there is great virtue in being the one with enough faith, because that's what it takes, and courage to speak out alone. But the princes deserve credit too. They may not have answered God's call to their hearts the first time, but the next time they had an opportunity to respond in righteousness, they did. Brothers and sisters, do not beat yourself up over lost opportunities, because many times God calls, we hear his voice, but we don't know what to do about it. We don't see our way clear. We don't understand it. Our faith is too weak. The examples around us are too poor. And we just let God's call go unanswered in our lives, vaguely conscious of missing out on something, unsure of what it was. But if we continue striving, struggling to understand the mystery of God in our lives, he's going to bring that call again. And there is still great virtue and great reward in answering his call the second time. Because Oded and the 4 princes spoke up. 2 Chronicles verse 14 says, the soldiers gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. Remarkable. You know how it is, though. Once someone comes to break up a fight, the bullies disperse pretty quickly. The soldiers just left. And the verse continues, the men designated by name took the prisoners, and from the plunder they clothed all who were naked. They provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All those who were weak, they put on donkeys, and so they took them back to their fellow countrymen at Jericho, the city of palms, and then returned to Samaria. Brothers and sisters, Oded was the original Good Samaritan. Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan in response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" And the story bears a striking resemblance to the story of Oded. Only in the New Testament version, the decisions and the actions are all very personal. It's all very private. But Oded, along with the princes of Ephraim, was a Samaritan who saw his brethren bruised and bleeding. He saw to it that their wounds were dressed, their bodies clothed, their needs attended to. He put the weak on donkeys and made sure they all got home. It was all very public. In the story that Jesus told, a Jewish man was attacked by robbers and left to die, while the priest and then a Levite passed by him in order to not inconvenience themselves. And it was a foreigner, a Samaritan, who recognized in that hurting Jewish man a kinsman, a man like himself, a brother in need of help. He took the time, the inconvenience, the expense to help a stranger. And he did it even though no one would ever have known if he had simply passed the man by. He too could have said the man's needs were too great and weren't his problem, and that he risked nothing by ignoring him. No one would have known, nor would anyone have blamed him if he'd simply minded his own business. In fact, no one would have known if he'd just kept walking. No one would have known if Oded had just kept quiet. No one would have known if Sugihara had just shut the doors. No one would have known that they had rejected the call God put upon their hearts. But God would have. He calls each of us to be righteous among the nations. Today, when we think of being a good Samaritan, we think of stopping to help someone change a flat tire, taking a neighbor to buy groceries, a good deed that requires some inconvenience on our part. But that's not what the story of the Good Samaritan was ever about. It wasn't about being a Boy Scout, about being nice. It was about integrity. Doing the righteous thing when no one was looking. Doing the righteous thing when everyone is looking, in the case of Oded. It's about doing the righteous thing because God has called us to be righteous among the nations. Amen. Great was Sugihara's faithfulness. To tell the truth, I thought about it all night. After struggling and agonizing, I concluded that humanity is paramount. Then, fearing nothing, I decided to issue those visas. Reminds me of Isaiah. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. great is thy faithfulness. That the Father may declare us each righteous among the nations when we come to a new land where we will get a new name. Right? That's my prayer and my blessing for you all.